It was Sunday, April 1st, 1984. News spread across Los Angeles that Marvin Gaye's life had been taken by his own father. Police surrounded the quiet Gramercy Place home, where the singer had been living with his parents. Inside, disbelief and heartbreak filled every room. Marvin Gaye Center. A retired preacher was led away in silence while his wife Alberta wept beside the body of her 44-year-old son, the man the world knew as the voice of what's going on. To fans, it was unimaginable. Marvin, whose music had carried messages of love, mercy, and redemption, gone in a single afternoon. But those closest to him knew this tragedy had been building for years. Marvin Sr. ruled his household with strict Pentecostal discipline. His wife offered comfort, while Marvin sought freedom in music. The more his fame grew, the wider the gap became between father and son, between pulpit and stage, obedience and independence. That Easter weekend, decades of tension reached a breaking point. An argument turned into a confrontation that neither man would survive the same way again. And before his death in 1998, Marvin Gaye Sr. finally spoke about what happened inside that house, and what he believed God would still forgive. What did he finally admit before he died, and why did he believe peace was still possible after taking his own son's life? Long before the fame, before the concerts and the Grammys, Marvin Gaye was a quiet boy growing up in a house where faith ruled every moment. His father, Marvin Gaye Sr., was a Pentecostal minister who believed discipline was the highest form of love. He preached fire and salvation from a small church in Washington, D.C., and expected his family to live by the same unyielding standard. Inside that narrow row house, religion wasn't just a Sunday ritual. It shaped how they spoke, how they dressed, how they were punished. The children rose each morning to the sound of their father's sermons echoing through the walls. He spoke of heaven and hell as if both were waiting just outside the door. His wife Alberta tried to soften the sharp edges of that faith, comforting the children when their father's anger flared. But even she knew that questioning him invited danger. Marvin, the second of 4 children, carried music in his voice before he could read a hymn book. In church, his singing drew stares. People said it was a gift from God. His father didn't see it that way. To him, it was pride disguised as praise. Marvin's voice might have filled the sanctuary, but it threatened the pulpit and the man who stood behind it. Their bond fractured early. Marvin longed for approval that never came, while his father seemed determined to prove that authority mattered more than affection. Beatings were common. Silence lasted days. Every act of rebellion, no matter how small, was treated like sin. When Marvin hummed rhythm and blues melodies under his breath, his father called it the devil's music. Still, Marvin couldn't help himself. Music was the one place where his spirit felt free. As the years passed, the pattern deepened. His father's sermons grew harsher, his temper quicker, his punishments heavier. The home became a place of rules, not rest. Marvin's mother, gentle and patient, often took the blows meant for her children, emotional and otherwise. She became the bridge between two worlds, the holy man who demanded perfection, and the son who only wanted love. By his teenage years, Marvin had begun to drift from the church. He joined neighborhood groups, found friendship in rhythm, and discovered a joy that didn't depend on fear. Yet every time he sang, a shadow followed him. The echo of his father's voice warning that freedom came with a price. Those early years built the foundation for everything that came later. The discipline made him precise. The rejection made him hungry. And the contradiction between his father's sermons and his own desires would become the defining struggle of his life. Behind every note he'd one day sing, there was a boy still standing in that narrow D.C. house, trying to reconcile the sound of a choir with the anger of a preacher. He had learned how to pray through song, but what he really wanted was his father to listen. When Marvin finally left Washington, D.C., it wasn't rebellion that pushed him out. It was survival. He had realized that if he stayed, he would lose the very thing that made him feel alive, his music. Joining the United States Air Force was his first escape, but even there the structure choked him. He wanted rhythm, not orders. Within months he was gone, chasing harmony instead of hierarchy. By the late 1950s, he found his footing in Harvey Fuqua's group, the Moonglows. It was in those rehearsals that his natural precision began to shine. Fuqua recognized what Marvin's father never had, a discipline rooted not in punishment, but in passion. When Berry Gordy heard that voice, smooth yet pleading, he signed him to Motown Records. Under Gordy's guidance, Marvin transformed from drummer to front-stage performer. His voice carried both joy and ache, refined gospel emotion wrapped in velvet. Early hits like Stubborn Kind of Fellow and How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You turned him into a rising star. Yet, even as he smiled on stage, something private lingered behind the perfection. Each song felt like an argument with the past, proof that he could create beauty from the pain he had fled. The more successful he became, the harder it was for him to return home. When he did visit, the distance between father and son was painfully obvious. Marvin Sr. refused to celebrate his fame. He called the music worldly, corrupting, proof that the boy he had once led in prayer was now lost to sin. Marvin, already struggling with self-doubt, carried that judgment like a weight around his neck. In interviews, he often spoke of his longing for spiritual connection. He believed God was in his music, even if the church didn't claim him anymore. But behind the studio doors, the pressure of fame brought new temptations. Long hours, constant touring, and the relentless need to sound perfect began to erode his peace. Then came Tammy Terrell, his duet partner and closest friend. Their chemistry gave the world some of Motown's purest moments, from Ain't No Mountain High Enough to You're All I Need to Get By. But when Tammy collapsed on stage and later died from a brain tumor, something inside Marvin broke. He withdrew from the spotlight, haunted by loss and guilt. Her death deepened his search for meaning. He turned to politics, soul, and spirituality, shaping a new kind of message for his generation. His next step would defy Motown's formula, and once again bring him into conflict with the man who had raised him. He had escaped his father's house, but not his father's shadow. And soon his music would speak louder than any sermon ever could. By the early 1970s, Marvin Gaye stood at the height of his artistry. The release of What's Going On in 1971 changed the sound of Motown and the direction of American music. It wasn't a love song or a dance track. It was a plea, a cry for peace, compassion, and justice in a country unraveling from war and division. Critics called it revolutionary. Fans called it healing. But for Marvin, it was deeply personal. Each lyric echoed his disillusionment, not just with politics, but with the kind of faith he had grown up under. The hymns of his childhood had promised clarity. The world he saw around him offered none. The sermons of his father had thundered about salvation, yet Marvin was surrounded by people in pain. What's Going On was his answer to all of it, a gospel for the broken-hearted. The album's success brought him peace for a moment, but only a moment. Behind the acclaim, Marvin wrestled with darker forces. Fame had magnified his insecurities. The discipline that once kept him sharp began to crumble under addiction, paranoia, and heartbreak. His marriage to Anna Gordy, Berry Gordy's sister, was unraveling. The wealth and admiration he had earned couldn't silence the voice in his head telling him he was still not good enough. While the public celebrated his compassion, Marvin's private life was filled with conflict. He feared judgment, from the press, from fans, and most of all from his father. The man whose approval he had sought his entire life still refused to acknowledge his success. Each new record brought praise from the world and silence from home. That silence stung more than any headline ever could. In his search for understanding, Marvin turned to religion again, but this time on his own terms. He studied scripture, mysticism, and self-reflection, looking for answers outside organized faith. He began to see music as his ministry. On stage, his voice soared. Off stage, he felt unworthy of the love he inspired. He prayed before every performance, not for success, but for forgiveness. Yet the more he sought peace, the harder it became to live with himself. Drugs became both comfort and punishment. He used them to quiet the same restlessness that had driven him since childhood. The stage became his confessional. Songs like Let's Get It On and Sexual Healing revealed his longing for intimacy, but also his shame. He called it the war between spirit and flesh, a phrase that seemed to define his life. By the end of the decade, the distance between Marvin and his father had turned into silence. They hadn't spoken meaningfully in years. Still, Marvin carried his father's presence everywhere, a figure of judgment lodged deep within his conscience. He had become a man adored by millions, yet haunted by one man's disappointment, and that quiet battle inside him was about to spill into the home he had tried so hard to escape. By the early 1980s, the glow of success had dimmed. Marvin Gaye's finances were in ruins, his health fragile, his spirit exhausted. The fame that once liberated him now felt like a trap. Years of recording, touring, and chasing perfection had left him empty. Cocaine use deepened his isolation, and his paranoia began to shadow every conversation. He believed people were watching him, conspiring against him. The warmth that once defined his music turned to fear. In 1981, he fled to Europe, searching for peace and anonymity. There, he found temporary relief in London and Ostend, where friends and fans treated him with compassion. But even surrounded by calm, he couldn't outrun the memories that haunted him. He spoke often of his father, of judgment and guilt, as if those echoes had followed him across the ocean. When his mother Alberta begged him to come home, he hesitated. He knew returning to Los Angeles meant confronting everything he had tried to bury. Yet by 1983, his health and finances left him little choice. The man who had once stood on world stages moved back into the house on Gramercy Place, sleeping just down the hall from the father he still feared. The reunion was uneasy from the start. Marvin Sr. had grown older and frail, but not gentler. He still carried the authority of a preacher, and the house moved to his rhythm. Marvin tried to keep the peace, retreating to his room, listening to gospel records, and writing new music that never seemed to reach completion. His mother remained the quiet buffer, tending to both men, as if they were wounded soldiers from the same war. Arguments flared over small things: money, noise, visitors, the television's volume. But beneath those petty sparks lay years of unspoken resentment. Marvin's success had once humiliated his father, and now his return symbolized defeat. The son who had soared above him was back under his roof, fragile and dependent. For a man who valued control above all, it was unbearable. Marvin, too, carried his own bitterness. He blamed his father for his lifelong shame, for the fear that shaped every choice. He wanted reconciliation but didn't know how to ask for it. Each morning began in silence. Each night ended with tension. Alberta described walking on eggshells, unsure when the next storm would break. Still, she believed they could heal. She prayed for patience, for grace, for her husband's temper to soften, and her son's anger to fade. But peace never arrived. What neither man could express in words was turning into something darker, something neither of them could control. The house that once echoed with hymns had become a battlefield of memories, and by Easter weekend, the faith that once held them together would shatter for good. It was Sunday, April 1st, 1984, the day before Marvin Gaye's 45th birthday. Inside the modest home on Gramercy Place, tension hung in the air. Marvin had spent much of that week withdrawn, nervous, pacing through rooms that felt too small for his restlessness. He barely slept. The previous night, his parents had argued again, this time over misplaced insurance papers. Alberta had tried to calm her husband, but Marvin intervened. demanding that his father stop shouting. It wasn't the first argument. It would be the last. That morning, Alberta recalled her son looking fragile yet protective. He stayed close to her side, refusing to let her speak alone with his father. The three of them shared the house in uneasy silence. Outside, the street was quiet, palm trees swaying in the spring air. Inside, a lifetime of tension waited for its spark. Shortly before noon, another argument erupted. Marvin Sr. accused Alberta of disobedience, his tone rising the way it had in the pulpit decades earlier. Marvin heard the voice he had feared all his life and stepped in once more, telling his father to leave his mother alone. Voices clashed. A push, a shout, a blur of motion. And then, in a moment too fast to comprehend, Marvin's father reached for the revolver his son had once given him for protection. 2 gunshots echoed through the hallway. One entered Marvin's chest, piercing his heart. Alberta screamed as her husband stood frozen, the gun trembling in his hand. She ran to her son, who fell into her arms, whispering a few faint words before his breathing stopped. Within minutes, she was dialing for help, praying it wasn't too late. Police arrived to find her crying beside her son's body, her husband standing nearby in shock. When they asked Marvin Sr. what had happened, his response was barely audible. He said he didn't mean to do it. Officers led him out of the house quietly, his face blank, his shoulders slumped under the weight of disbelief. News spread within hours. Reporters gathered outside, their cameras flashing as neighbors watched from the sidewalk. The world couldn't process what had happened. The singer who had given voice to love and understanding had died in a moment of family tragedy. For millions, it felt like losing a piece of their own history. That afternoon, Alberta sat alone in her kitchen, her husband held in custody, her son gone forever. The sound of police radios mixed with the hum of reporters outside. The home that had once echoed with sermons and songs now held only silence. The tragedy on Gramercy Place wasn't the act of a single day. It was the final note in a story written by years of pain, pride, and unhealed wounds. But even after that moment, one more chapter remained: the father's confession and what he said before he died. In the weeks that followed, the story dominated headlines around the world. Fans mourned in the streets, gathering outside Motown offices, laying flowers and notes beneath posters of Marvin's smiling face. Inside Los Angeles County Jail, his father sat alone in a medical ward, pale and withdrawn. He was 70 years old, frail from surgery and age. When detectives asked him to explain what happened, he struggled to find words. "I didn't mean it," he said softly. "I was afraid of him." Prosecutors charged Marvin Gaye Sr. with first-degree murder, but his health and the circumstances complicated everything. His wife, Alberta, testified that her husband had been angry that morning, but she also told the court that her son had struck him first during the argument. She described years of tension between the two men, decades of conflict that made that single moment impossible to separate from the past. Psychiatric evaluations revealed that Marvin Sr. had a brain tumor and signs of dementia. The defense argued diminished capacity. The prosecution, recognizing his age and declining condition, agreed to reduce the charge. In November 1984, the verdict came: voluntary manslaughter, a suspended 6-year sentence and 5 years of probation. To the public, it felt incomplete, a life taken, and no prison time. But for Alberta, the punishment didn't matter. She had already lost both husband and son, one to death and one to guilt. She told reporters she could never hate either of them. "My son is gone," she said, "and my husband has to live with what he's done." In the years that followed, Marvin Sr. lived quietly in a small apartment in Los Angeles. He rarely spoke to the press, avoiding attention and church alike. He walked with a cane, his voice slower, his eyes heavy, but when he did speak, his words carried the weight of regret and denial. He said he loved his son, but that he didn't recognize him anymore. He claimed Marvin had become violent, that he feared him, that the devil had taken hold. It wasn't until the mid-90s, as his own health deteriorated, that he began to speak more openly. In interviews, he said he thought of his son every day. He admitted he prayed for forgiveness but stopped short of taking full responsibility. "I loved him," he said once, "but he pushed me too far." Even then, the conflict that had defined their relationship, the struggle between authority and remorse, remained unresolved. He died in October 1998, at the age of 84, after battling pneumonia. At the time of his death, he was still haunted by what had happened in that house. He told a friend shortly before passing that he hoped to see his son again in heaven, if the Lord allows it. In the end, his confession wasn't one of clarity, it was one of contradiction. He sought forgiveness without fully facing what he had done, and the silence he left behind said more than any sermon ever could. After the tragedy, the world tried to understand how a family built on faith could end in such devastation. Fans mourned the artist, but they also grieved the man they felt they knew, the gentle voice, the soul of compassion, the messenger of unity. Radio stations played "What's Going On" for days without pause, the lyrics now carrying a deeper ache. Each line about mercy and understanding seemed written for the very moment he was taken from the world. For Alberta, life became quiet. She moved away from Gramercy Place and lived out her remaining years surrounded by grandchildren and memories. She rarely spoke about that Easter morning, except to say that she forgave her husband. "I can't carry hate," she said once. "It destroys what's left of you." Her faith, tested beyond measure, remained her anchor. To her, forgiveness wasn't approval, it was survival. Marvin's siblings struggled too. Some found it impossible to reconcile their father's actions with the man who once led them in prayer. Others chose silence. But all of them carried the shadow of what had happened. In interviews years later, his sister Jean said the hardest part was knowing that both men had been victims of the same pain, one unable to love, the other unable to heal. The music, however, endured. "What's Going On? Let's Get It On." And Sexual Healing found new generations of listeners. To many, Marvin Gaye became more than a performer. He was a symbol of human contradiction, brilliance and brokenness in the same breath. His songs stood as a reminder that art can reveal what life often hides. They still fill churches, movies, and celebrations, bridging generations that never even lived through his time. As for his father, his final years passed in near obscurity. His confession, fragmented and uneasy, became part of Marvin's story, not the end of it. Historians and biographers have long debated whether he ever truly understood the weight of what he'd done. Some say his mind never accepted it. Others believe he died still convinced that God had forgiven him. In the decades since, Marvin's name has come to represent more than tragedy. His voice is now a prayer for reconciliation, his story a warning about the cost of silence. For all his flaws, his art pointed to something greater, the possibility that pain can still produce grace. Marvin Gaye's life was short, but his message endures. Through his music, he continues to ask the same question he once sang to the world: "What's going on?" It's a question about love, about peace, and about the fragile lines that hold families together. And maybe that's the legacy he left behind. Not perfection, not resolution, but the reminder that even in our darkest moments, forgiveness is still possible. The story of Marvin Gaye is not just the story of a gifted musician. It's the story of a son who spent his life trying to bridge the distance between love and authority, faith and fear. He poured that conflict into every note, transforming personal pain into music that could heal others. His father's confession, spoken years later, did not erase what happened. It revealed how guilt can live inside a man who once believed he was doing right. In the end, both father and son were searching for the same thing: peace. They just never found it in time. Today, Marvin's songs remain timeless because they carry that human contradiction. They remind listeners that compassion is stronger than judgment, and that forgiveness, even when it feels impossible, can still save what's left of us. The tragedy that ended his life continues to echo because it speaks to something every family understands: the struggle to love one another despite the weight of expectation. For Marvin, music was the only place where that love could live freely. He left behind melodies that still comfort and convict in equal measure. Each lyric feels like a prayer whispered from a man who understood the cost of love and the power of grace. Marvin Gaye's voice may have fallen silent, but his message never did. It remains a reminder that peace is not found in control but in understanding. For more emotional stories, check out this video.